I like movies. Most people do it. It's a pretty common thing. A lot of people watch movies. But I especially like good movies. And even more specifically than that, I like good superhero movies. These past couple of years have been a golden age of superhero movies. We've gotten so many amazing films, and the reach that these movies have is just incredible. 4 of the top 10 highest grossing movies are Marvel movies. That's pretty crazy. I really do like Marvel movies, and a lot of them are pretty good, but only some of them are really great. Infinity War is the perfect example of that, and definitely my favorite Marvel movie of all time. Nobody actually expected Thanos to win. Everybody thought the first movie was going to be Thanos going around collecting the first half of the stones, and then part 2 would be him getting the other half and barely getting stopped by the Avengers at the end. You know, the usual superhero plotline. I remember walking out of that theater after that movie's climax, just being completely shook. Nobody was even talking about that movie. They were just as shocked as I was. And that experience is something no Marvel movie was able to do for me until that point. Infinity War set up perfectly for Endgame, and I remember a lot of people saying they were even more excited for Endgame after how good the ending was. I didn't really feel that way. My thought process was more reserved. I thought to myself, there is no way they're going to be able to top that. And boy, was I right. I was so excited for Endgame, and I didn't watch a single trailer. I avoided every ad and promo like my crush avoided me in high school. I was waiting for this movie to come out, and I wanted to go in completely blind. When I finally did see it, about halfway through, I was already not feeling it. I left the theater feeling pretty disappointed. I knew I didn't like it, even though I tried so hard to enjoy it. So now I'm going to break down why Avengers Endgame is not that good. So, before we get into the whole meat of this, I just want to put out a disclaimer that the MCU to me is basically like an alternate universe to the comics. They're basing these movies kind of lightly on the source material, and that's okay. I don't really want them to make a movie that's just ripped right out of the comics because it's really hard to adapt a comic book or really any book to the screen. It doesn't always work well, and especially for comic books, there's some things that just wouldn't really make sense. I think the MCU has done an excellent job at kind of making their alternate universe work. We see this done super well with like Civil War, because the Civil War in the MCU and the Civil War of the comics are completely different. The only thing that's similar is that Iron Man and Captain America have a little hissy fit and get upset and fight each other. That's what's similar. Basically nothing else is the same. In the movie, we see Bucky as like a main reason why this team gets driven apart. And the Winter Soldier isn't even in the comics. You see, in the movie version, we have Helmut Zemo, who's the main catalyst for why this team starts to split. And he's also not even in the comic. In the comic version, what causes the team to split is the ideals. The beliefs that Iron Man and Captain America hold is what split the team apart. But regardless of all that, it doesn't really matter. Civil War as a movie is great. I actually like it a lot. It's one of my favorite movies. Here's my MCU tier list, by the way. Feel free to disagree, but it's clearly the best one. The other thing that I want to point out as far as Endgame is that the fact that Adam Warlock is not in this movie is, again, like I said, totally fine. Adam Warlock is basically the hero in the comic book version of Infinity War, and he's just not in this movie, and that's okay. I'm fine with that. Doesn't really matter. Aside from that, let's talk about the first and really the biggest problem with Avengers Endgame, and that is the main plot point that is time travel. When I was watching this movie in theaters, I wasn't really a big fan of the whole time travel arc. They end up making it necessary to the plot because of how they set up the movie, but the time travel itself, the rules that they make don't really make a lot of sense, and they don't even follow them that closely. But before we get into that, let's talk about the main problem with time travel. Now, when we look at this time travel explanation scene, we find out that the rules are laid out pretty simply right at the beginning of the movie, which is pretty important for this movie because they tell you that they're not going to be following the same rules that time travel normally does in movies. They make fun of Back to the Future, they make fun of Hot Tub Time Machine, because the time travel in these movies is pretty much the same. When you go back in the past, you can change the future if you're not careful. Right now, if I were to burn down my house, then I wouldn't have a house to live in the future. That's pretty standard stuff. So naturally, if you go back in the past and you change something, that can have unseen repercussions. This is the crux of every time travel movie pretty much ever made. So at the beginning of this movie, they tell you, we're not going to do it like that, which I guess is fine. But then when they explain the rules, they basically tell you, okay, you can't change the past no matter what you do. The past is solidified. Then later on, we actually find out that the Ancient One tells us that the past is only changed if an Infinity Stone is removed from the situation or in a different spot than where it was originally intended to be. So we see this at the beginning with her little time travel, time windy, bendy, windy stuff line, where she basically says if you take out an Infinity Stone, then it is going to collapse that entire timeline. All right, cool. Then Hulk argues if we just put it back in at the same time, it'll basically never be gone, which makes sense. If it never left, then it would be always in that timeline as long as it gets returned. Then the movie kind of starts breaking its own rules. In the very same scene, we see that they actually mess up the first heist on the Space Stone, and Loki gets away, which creates an entirely different timeline. We find out after this movie, like a couple days later, that they're actually going to be doing a Loki TV show, and it's going to be about what happens after that. But they don't even talk about it in the movie. This is a huge problem. The only rule that they said is do not remove the stones. And the first thing they do on their very first attempt is lose a stone and let loose this guy who just killed millions of people. And they don't even talk about it. They're just like, well, guess we're going to try again at a different time. It really doesn't make any sense. It's bad. And you know what? The whole point of setting up for another TV series, I get it. They want to continue their line after this movie is over. But come on, you couldn't even put in a throwaway line where Captain America is like, we can't worry about that now. All that matters is that we get another stone or whatever. Like, come on, just put some effort into it. They spend a lot of time in this movie driving home the fact that their time travel is different than everyone else's time travel. But then they play the whole movie like it's a normal time travel movie. Imagine if this movie didn't have that stupid rule of nothing in the past can be changed. Look at them. They're sneaking around the Avengers Tower. They're not trying to alert anybody. They go down to Vormir. They're not trying to alert anybody. They knock out Star-Lord. They're doing the whole movie as if what they do in the past can change the future. I mean, if you're thinking about this, right, what's the best plan here? Are you really trying to sneak around and wait, who knows what might happen? The best way to actually go about grabbing the Infinity Stones in this movie would be to just nuke Stark Tower, kill everyone, and grab the Space Stone from the rubble. Then, once you've undone the snap, go back in time and return it, because none of that will actually happen because you can't change the past. So this movie should be so simple. All you need to do is run in guns blazing, grab the stone, and it doesn't matter if anyone sees you, because as long as you return it, the timeline will be corrected. But, of course, that makes for a terrible movie, so they're not going to do it that way. So what do? They play pretend that what you do in the past could change the future. It doesn't make any sense. Just don't make this stupid rule, and this movie is instantly better. For another huge reason. Morag. Now, this part I realized a couple of days ago, and it actually made the movie even worse for me. So the whole climax of this movie is that the younger Thanos finds out what's going to happen to him in the future, and he's okay with it. But then he realizes that his plan is actually not going to work. So he finds a way to actually teleport himself and his entire ship into the future so that way he can get the stones again and restart the entire universe. Now, I have another problem with this whole restart the universe thing, but we'll get to that later. The main point of this section is that using the time travel rules previously established by this movie, Thanos could not possibly be in the future. The whole point is that what you do in the past does not actually change the past. It is solidified, not going anywhere. So the fact that Nebula can lead Thanos into the future doesn't make any sense, because later on in the movie, Captain America returns the Power Stone, which means that that timeline would be corrected, meaning Nebula would never be there and Thanos would never find out. This is such a glaring plot hole, I can't believe I didn't realize it sooner. They set this whole movie up to have a different time travel rule when it really would have been better served to just have normal time travel. I can't understand why they would write this movie this way with a special rule and then just play it like a normal time travel movie. Imagine if they got rid of that stupid rule that says you can't change the past unless you move an Infinity Stone. All of a sudden, this movie actually makes sense. If you look at Loki's escape, okay, that creates an alternate timeline because an Infinity Stone actually moved. And then when you get to Thanos, you see that, oh, Nebula got stuck in the past, which actually changes the future. That makes sense too, because now that you have this stupid rule, the entire half of this movie should not have happened. This is honestly the worst part of this entire movie. I didn't realize it until I was rewatching it a couple days ago, but man, it is painfully bad when you realize how much these guys screwed up this time travel rule. That's pretty much everything for the time travel section, so now we're going to go on to part 2, which is equally as bad, the characters. Endgame is a movie about tying up loose ends. Pretty much throughout the movie, we see the culmination of all these different characters' arcs coming to an end, and for the most part, I would say they did all right. They tied up a lot of things and pretty much had a clean ending for the larger portion of the MCU. However, oh boy, did they screw up on some big ones. The first one we're going to talk about is Thanos. Thanos sucks in this movie. There's no nice way to say it. He's a bad character. In Infinity War, he is such a compelling villain because in all the screen time that he has, you get an understanding for his character and you realize this guy actually believes what he's saying. The problem with supervillains in a lot of different movies is that they don't feel very real. They all feel like these maniacal villains who want to take over the world, and their motivations are never really that fleshed out. It's usually something really simple like, oh, some bad experience happened when I was young and that's fueled me to become who I am, and it's pretty played out, and it's usually not done that well. But Thanos in Infinity War was different. Thanos has more screen time in Infinity War than any single other superhero, and it really served that movie well for letting you know who this guy is and why he does what he does. Thanos is surprisingly relatable in Infinity War, and it's not something that I think anyone really expected. We see him talking about his quest and what he needs to do, and he doesn't necessarily think that he's the good guy. He thinks of himself more as the only one with the willpower to do what's necessary to save the universe. We see this in all of his dialogue. He doesn't talk about how he wants to destroy the world because that's just what he wants to do. He's trying to save it. In Thanos' eyes, he's the hero of this story, and as the audience, you actually believe him. It's something that I've never seen in another superhero movie where the main villain was somehow relatable. It doesn't really seem like it because all of his motivations and his entire goal is so opposite of what we would think as relatable, and yet somehow he is. Unfortunately, that entire arc is pretty much thrown out the window for Endgame. The Thanos that we see at the beginning of Endgame is one who's completed his quest. He is finished. He's done what he's needed to do, and he's okay with dying. We see the younger Thanos in the middle of Endgame agree with that. He's understanding because he knows that it's all right if he dies because he has done what he's needed to do. But then he realizes that it doesn't actually work, that over the past 5 years, things have gotten worse for people and no one's really moved on. So then he comes to the conclusion that the only way to truly fulfill his quest is to destroy the entire universe. This is such a huge step back for his character that it's almost insulting to the Thanos from the first movie. Even if his plan wasn't really going to work, why would he just decide to destroy the entire universe? What's the point of that? It's only been 5 years. It's not like it's not going to pan out in the future. I mean, you don't know, dude. 5 years is not that long. I mean, all things considered. So the fact that he just turns into this maniacal supervillain who's now out for the destruction of the universe just feels cheap, and it doesn't really feel as good as the Thanos from the last movie. The other big problem with this version of Thanos is that he doesn't have any connection to anyone. He literally just doesn't know who anybody is, and all these people have these deep emotional ties to Thanos and he just like looks at them with this blank stare. The worst part, I think, for that whole example is probably Scarlet Witch when she shows up to him and says, "You took everything from me," and he's like, it just feels terrible because we saw so much development between all these characters in Infinity War, and it pretty much just gets thrown away because of the way that the plot moved. It just doesn't really feel that good. The other big problem is his power level in this movie makes no sense. At the end of Infinity War, we see Thanos with a almost complete Infinity Gauntlet just run through all the Avengers. He's still missing a stone, and nobody stands a chance against him. He's just basically walking through all of them. And then we get to see Thanos at his most powerful. He gets the Mind Stone, completes his Infinity Gauntlet, and now he's a god. Right after that, we see Thor come down and throw Stormbreaker right at him, resist the full power of all 6 stones, and still hit Thanos. Then in Endgame, Thanos with no Infinity Gauntlet is able to whack Stormbreaker to the side like it's no big deal. The power comparisons in these movies are so skewed, it just doesn't make sense. Thanos in the comics is already a really powerful being, so you can make the argument that maybe he'd be able to fight off some of the Avengers without the Infinity Gauntlet. But the problem is that he lost in the last movie, and he had the Infinity Gauntlet against the same guy. It just doesn't make any sense, and the movie decides not to address it because, well, I don't know, it just doesn't address it. I think Thor and Captain America are pretty much in a race to see who's the worst character in Endgame, but we'll get to those in a little bit. Who I want to talk about right now is Gamora, who is just a wreck of a character in this movie. We know that the older Gamora died, so she has no impact on this movie other than she basically gave Thanos the Soul Stone. Doesn't really count. The only Gamora we see in this movie is the younger version. Now, she ends up betraying Thanos, and it's just wrong. The reasoning behind this is that the older version of Nebula basically shows up and tells her, look, you're gonna betray him in the future. And Gamora buys this. I don't know why, as Gamora, your whole motivation for betraying Thanos is a different version of my sister told me I'm going to betray him, so I guess I'll just do it now. It really doesn't make sense. If someone came to your house, told you they were from the future, and told you to kill your parents because you're gonna do it later, would you really do it? It does not make any sense. Her motivation is all over the place. The other big problem is that all of her character development from Guardians of the Galaxy hasn't happened yet. She is not the same character at this point in the story that she will be later on. The first time we see her in this movie is her helping Thanos kill a bunch of innocent people on some planet. Go back and watch. That's literally the first place we see her, is on Thanos' ship flying away from a dying planet. She is still totally invested in Thanos' plan to cleanse the universe. The other issue is that she has no reason to trust future Nebula. All she knows about this version of Nebula is that she's a traitor. Why in the world would she believe a single word that she says? That's it for Gamora. Now we're going to do Captain Marvel. So I'm going to be honest, I haven't seen Captain Marvel yet, and I really don't care to. It clearly wasn't that important to the whole plot of Endgame in the first place, so I'll probably never get around to it. But just basing Captain Marvel off of this movie alone, she is so annoying. The very first interaction that we really get with her is when she's talking with the rest of the Avengers, and they're pretty much asking, where were you when the rest of the universe got killed? And her response was pretty much, I'm busy. What are you talking about? I get that Earth isn't the only planet in the universe, so, I guess that makes sense. But this fight was definitely about more than Earth. Half of the universe got eradicated, and you just weren't there? And then your excuse at the end is, I was busy? Unless you were protecting over 50% of the population of the universe, this one's kind of on you. It isn't really Brie Larson's fault that this character is just the worst one in the movie. Her lines are so bad, it just makes her seem so arrogant and frankly just stupid. Everyone's favorite part of Captain Marvel in this movie is when she gets punched in the face by Thanos at the end. And now for the final and, in my opinion, the worst part of the movie, the end. So, this is going to be a little bit of a continuation of the last segment because the ending of the movie is about the characters. They're reacting to ultimately the death of Iron Man and their own decisions they've made throughout the MCU. You have the character endings for two of the biggest characters in the entire MCU, Captain America and Thor. We're going to talk about Thor's ending first because it's only second worst. I don't know, maybe it's worst. It's a close tie. Like I said, they're racing for the finish. So, Thor is struggling with self worth throughout this movie. We see at the end of Infinity War, he gets so close to defeating Thanos, but ultimately fails. The entire universe dies, and he kind of takes it on as his fault. Plus, throughout the duration of the last couple movies Thor has been in, all of his family and everyone he knows has pretty much been killed. He doesn't have a lot left. So I actually kind of like the Fat Thor arc in this movie. Despite having the worst ending, I think Thor has the most character development out of anyone else in this movie. We see Thor slowly gaining confidence as the film progresses. The high point for him is when he reaches out and realizes he's still worthy to wield Mjolnir despite everything that's happened. Now, normally at this point, when the film is closing, you would expect Thor to return back to New Asgard and begin to lead his people triumphantly now that he's found his courage again. But no, instead, he decides to give up his entire kingdom to her, which, don't get me wrong, I think she's an okay character, but I mean, come on, really? He just gives up all of his responsibility, and not even just his responsibility, but something that he's been waiting for a long time. We see him returning to Asgard in Thor Ragnarok, and he's getting ready to lead, and the movie closes, and he's finally in charge of Asgard. It's great. The ending's fantastic. And then when he finally has the chance to do that, I guess his character just decided that he's gonna give up. And that's the real problem with the ending of Avengers Endgame, is that it's about giving up. And nothing says giving up like Captain America. If you thought there was something wrong with me saying nothing says giving up like Captain America, that's because Captain America doesn't give up. I mean, if there's one thing that we've seen this guy say in all these movies is, I could do this all day. Like, what are you talking about? This guy is going to get hit an entire movie and keep standing up no matter what. That's the entire embodiment of Captain America, is that he's never going to give up. But at the end of this movie, he just gives up. They throw out movies and movies of character development just so they can get this happy ending with Steve, and it just isn't real. He gave up on that life a long time ago, and he's talked about it many times. It's just not something that Captain America would do in this situation. The Earth just lost Iron Man, and now he's going to abandon the Avengers? What are we just pretending like the Earth is never going to need defending again? Like, this is it? Thanos was the final boss? They're just never going to have to fight anyone again? We're not even really going to talk about the whole problem with the time travel implications, about whether or not Steve was actually Peggy's husband the whole time, or whether or not he made out with his great niece. It really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, this whole decision that Steve makes at the end of Endgame is just not something that he would do. I thought of a better ending for this movie that I actually kind of like. Basically, Steve would go back in time and return the Infinity Stones, and when Hulk and everyone else is wondering, like, oh, where'd he go? He would show up, like, a couple seconds late. Falcon would say a line like, oh, I thought we lost you. Or something like, oh, didn't think you were going to come back. And Steve would look at him and say, I'll always be here for you. And then it'll throw back to Steve in his army uniform standing outside Peggy's house with flowers, and him about to knock but then hesitating as he's thinking about the implications of what he's doing and just leaving the flowers at the door and walking away. That would be way more in line with Steve's character than the ending that they actually went with. And once I kind of thought of that ending, I was pretty bummed. For a movie that has two different scenes of noble sacrifices, of people putting down their lives for the greater good, to see that same movie end with two characters acting so selfishly just felt tonally off. Avengers Endgame wasn't a terrible movie. I actually like quite a few parts of it. There's some scenes that are good, some scenes that are hilarious, and some scenes that are just jaw dropping. But at the end of the day, I don't think it was enough to really save this movie from the biggest problem that it had, which is it just wasn't quite the proper send off for the MCU. There was a lot of hype, and I don't know if they had any way to possibly live up to it, but it just fell short. And for Avengers Endgame, the death was in the details.